Here's a question for you. Why would God make it so complex to understand Christianity? It's not actually my phrasing on that. There's a comment from a couple videos back where somebody whose name I can't put on the screen because they put the F-bomb in it asks exactly that. I think that's a very fair question. Given the context of the conversation that was happening in the comment section, I think it might have been asked as a pushback against Christianity, but I think that's a question that a person of faith can really reasonably ask as well. And so I'm going to treat it like that's a question asked in goodwill and kind of game that out. Because if I'm to be truthful, that's something that is eaten at me a little bit, both during the time in my life when I was not a Christian or a person of any belief in God, and also during the much larger percentage of my life when I've been a person of faith. I mean, yeah, kind of what gives, I mean, if it seems like if there's a God who wants to be known really well and he wants people to worship him and he's the point of everything and he's reaching out and going to all the effort anyway to get into our space to know us and to be known, I mean, why wouldn't you make it easy? Why wouldn't you eliminate this point of contention that everybody's going to see stuff differently and argue? I mean, doesn't that make God look bad? Doesn't that make your followers look bad? Why not instead set it up in such a way where it's just very plainly laid out and you've got one pretty long but pretty doable list of descriptors of how God is, and then another list of what people who follow God are supposed to do, and then you'd have one uniform standard for how everybody who follows that God would act, and then it would make it much simpler and it would eliminate these kind of nagging doubts for people like me and username that I'm not going to say on this channel. So here's the deal. I think the first fair response that you've got to consider to the question of why did God make it so complex to understand Christianity is the one that maybe the commenter's driving at, maybe he's not. And that's just, there is no God. And the fact that it is so complex is what points out that the whole thing is a big giant sham. And that this is entirely the work of humans who were using the notion of a God to jockey for power throughout history. And so as a result, they're all going to format their theology in ways that are beneficial to their in-group and punishing to their out-group. And when you project that out over several thousand years, what you get is all kinds of conflicting stuff, and it just gets impossible to sort through, and that's why it becomes so complex. I don't think that, but I wondered that once, and so I think it's only fair to acknowledge that good and honest people in their process of faith or not faith might ask that question and look at the data and give that answer. But let me throw out some considerations that assume there is a God behind this, since that's where I land and that's kind of where my brain is at in processing out the question. I suppose another reason, or a second reason, that that the whole Christian thing seems so complex, and is an explanation as to why God would make it that way, would just be that maybe some of us are misreading the complexity and it's not actually that complex. Well, I tend to think it's pretty complex. There are a lot of questions to wrestle through, and it seems like an infinite number of questions to wrestle through. But I know a lot of people, good people, not simple people, not rubes, not backward people, but quality, smart, thinking, professional, well-educated people who seem to have, to use the religious term for it here, some kind of gift of faith. And if there is a God on the other side of the equation, it looks like from time to time, he imparts to an individual this ability to see stuff and get stuff and believe stuff and have a certainty and a clarity on it that that I just think I'm not wired for. I am a person of faith, but I'm wired to be a skeptic. I like to ask questions and poke at things. And I know other religious people who aren't like that, and I don't think they're dumb for it. I think it's possible that that is the work of the supernatural. So in regard to the question, if God wants to be known, why did he make it so complex? If there's really a God, why is Christianity so complex? I suppose solution number one is there is no God and the whole thing's a sham, and that's why it's so complicated. I suppose solution number 2, though, would be maybe it's not as complex as we think, and some of us overthink it. Okay, I'm going to be honest. I don't think those are the 2 best answers, so let me explore a third one. Christianity is a very ancient religion, and I suppose it's possible that the writing of the Bible and the explanation of theology was geared first and foremost to the people at the moments in history when it was being written and being revealed. I know as I try to work my way through the Old Testament, the New Testament, one of the things I really have to labor to do is to put myself in the shoes, in the cultural setting, in the mindset of that original audience. If I don't bother to take that extra step in studying the Bible, it seems like I have a lot of things fly over my head, or I inflict modern questions or contemporary social preferences onto the text, and I kind of miss the whole point. So it's also possible that the reason it's so complex is because this whole thing was designed to unfold over time, but most of the communication happened a long time ago in other parts of the world, and what made a lot of sense to people there maybe is a bit more challenging, and as different cultures and different people throughout time interpret that stuff differently, we arrive at different conclusions, and as a result, it gets complex. So I guess that's my, off the top of my head, option number 3 here. Possibility number 4 is that it's part complex and part not complex, and there is a God behind it, and God designed it to be that way. Let me see if I can do a better job of explaining what I'm trying to say here. I think it's possible that the front end of Christian faith isn't that tricky. There was an evangelist, an African-American dude who came around to our church a couple times when I was a kid, and I really liked him. His name was Sam. And I remember him doing this thing. It's one of my first memories from church. He held up his fingers and he spelled Christ, like Christ. Coming home really isn't so tough. And then I think the point that he was making there is, hey, everybody, if you're thinking about becoming a Christian, you can just do that. If it seems like the whole salvation thing isn't that hard, if it seems like it's as simple as you used to acknowledge some other God as king of everything, or yourself as king of everything, but when you realize who God is and who Jesus is and you acknowledge him as king of everything, that's kind of what it is to enter into this, this Christian thing. I think that's what he was saying. But then he went on to say that what happens after that pretty straightforward, pretty easy to understand beginning point of faith, that what happens next is kind of where the fun is. That there's this infinite list of questions and this unbound by time, eternal opportunity to wrestle through all of the important things in existence and to understand more about the nature of this infinite being God. Now, I'm using my own language. That's not exactly how he said it. He said it in ways that were meant to make sense to a kid like me, but I think you get what I'm driving at. A fourth possibility here is that the reason Christianity seems so complex and claims to have a God behind it might be because there really is a God behind it. He makes the entry point to faith pretty accessible and pretty straightforward, but that is like the tippy tip of the iceberg, and there's this infinite, unending iceberg extending under the surface forever that really is the bulk of what the Christian faith is about. Dwelling in that, exploring that, fleshing that out, figuring out where you fit in that much bigger set of questions. So I suppose that's a possibility as well. I want to make sure I'm still phrasing the question right, because I feel like I'm screwing it up. Okay, that username is spectacular. It's the F-bomb, but it's like the way you'd expect Liam Neeson to say it when he's being really, really Irish with his accent. I'm not going to do it, but all you are doing it right now. Why would God make it so complex to understand Christianity? Okay. This is the one that I think is my best shot at trying to explain this. When you talk about theology, when you talk about religion of any kind, when you talk about Christianity, what you're talking about is an interaction between two parties, right? Humans like you and me, and God, the divine. Well, we understand a lot about humanity. I'm going to do a Venn diagram. I need circles. I'm going to use these coasters. They're going to work. My friend Bethany got these for me. Made them for me even? I don't know. So I've got these trout coasters. Let me get them in focus. Okay, so let's say that this one over here is the circle that represents the finite. People like you and me with limits, and people who get older and are going to die someday and can't know everything. Even though we're limited, if we put all of our brains and processing power together throughout the history of ever, we actually know quite a bit of stuff about people and about our environment and the physical world and everything else. So it feels like we can know some things about us and the finite. Believe it or not, I'm also really optimistic that we can know some things about the, in focus, Matthew, the infinite. It is the stuff of God. I think that we have the ability to reason to some extent to the nature of an unlimited, ultimate being, a being that there's no higher, no greater being that can be imagined than such a being. I think that we can look at our environment and deduce things about whatever force made such an environment and put such order into things. I also think that specific revelation, and I know that right now there are people who are watching this who are like, wow, I think things are chaos. I don't think you can look at the natural world and understand things about God. I think you're being way too optimistic, Matt, about your ability to reason to things about God. And I don't trust your Bible, so I don't think it's particularly reliable either. You know what? I'm glad you're here. We see this a little bit differently. That's all right. Humor my argument for a minute and see if it makes any sense if you grant these assumptions. So we know stuff about the finite. I think there are multiple ways through reason, through nature, through the Bible, that we can know stuff about the infinite, deity, God. And when we deal with these two questions separately, it's hard, but it's not that hard. It's not where the really difficult, complex stuff about faith happens. When it gets hard is when you do this. This is doable, but this little Venn diagram shaded area in the middle, that's where I think it gets challenging. There's a natural friction that occurs when you take something that operates within boundaries, the finite, humans, and you try to mingle it with something that operates with no boundaries, the infinite. I mean, just think about taking something that if we just even acknowledge one of our boundaries, time. How do you mush together the story and the mind of something bound by time with the story and the mind of something unbound by time? It's one of the most basic defining parameters of our existence. And if you take that away and talk about the divine, whoa, these are such different entities. And I think sometimes we like to imagine a deity who's kind of just like us and has the same limitations as us, but is like a kind of exalted superhero version. But I'm an atheist toward that kind of deity. I'm talking about the kind that is transcendent. Well, when you take the finite and the infinite and you mush them together, the friction starts to happen. And I think it must happen. And you think about the really hard questions that have boggled the minds of the best philosophers and theologians for all of time, that the toughest questions that maybe even cause people to choose not to believe in God. Maybe the tough questions that have caused you, if that's where you land, to not believe in God. All of those hardest questions are the overlap questions. They're the shaded area questions. So you get here, and we ask the question, how do we resolve God's sovereignty and unlimitedness with human freedom? That's a shaded area question. That's the finite bumping up against the infinite, and it's hard. How does God become man? How does the infinite take on flesh and be born and die in the physical world? That's a shaded area question, and it's really hard to understand. Why does the God of the Old Testament seem to be okay with him judging people and even smiting or killing people when he tells us not to judge and not to smite? Well, again, we're getting into this shaded area kind of stuff. And so maybe I'm getting in the weeds a little bit here. It's what happens when you just run it live. I think an answer to the question, which once again is, why would God make it so complex to understand Christianity? I'm not sure that was God being a jerk or trying to make it difficult to see what we would do or to test us somehow. I don't think I don't think God had set things up so that you have to be a certain degree of fancy intellectual or super smart philosophy type in order to know God or have a relationship with God. I think instead, that complexity is a beautiful, natural, necessary byproduct of the divine, the boundless, stepping into the realm of the finite, the bounded, and trying to do something about our situation. And further, if we imagine or invent a God where these frictions don't exist because we don't want it to be complicated or confusing, the way we're going to arrive at that is by stripping this God in our mind of his authority and power and otherness from us. And when we do that, we might invent a version of God that's easier to reconcile in our brains and where we don't feel such complexity and don't feel kind of overwhelmed and intimidated in coming at these questions. But in doing so, we've created a God who isn't powerful enough to do anything about the human condition. And if that's the case, why have a religion at all? Why worship any God at all? At that point, I think it's just an exercise in futility and silliness. Now, I would take it even a step further. Not only do I think the complexity is necessary, not only do I think that I would be skeptical of any version of religion that didn't have those necessary complex questions where the overlap stuff happens between the finite and the infinite, but I'll take it further and say that I like it. At first, I didn't like it. I think I'm somebody who can be intimidated by things on the front end a little bit. And when I'm a little bit intimidated by things, one of my knee-jerk reactions is to just say, this whole thing is stupid and dumb. I lived in Las Vegas for a while, and maybe there's things about Las Vegas that are stupid and dumb. But when I first moved there were a lot of people, my friends, associates, who really liked it. And they were like, no, there's a lot of neat things about this town. But because it was so big and so bright and so overwhelming for me, my initial knee-jerk reaction was to be dismissive of it. Like, let me offer a really clever critique of why this is dumb. But the more I got to know the town, the more I got to see things about it that were redemptive and good, and even the broken things about it I came to appreciate for what they were. And I think we work the same way with ideas sometimes. The complexity initially scares us off, is almost gross, but when we're around something for a little while and we start to understand why there's complexity, then the complexity becomes appealing and beautiful and inviting and an adventure and something that you want to tear into and that you want to sidle up alongside because the complexity is bigger than you. And even though we don't like it at first, generally speaking, we do like things that are bigger than us. It's lonely imagining that we're the biggest, most important thing. And so for me, not only am I at peace with that complexity as a necessary byproduct of the intersection between the infinite and the finite, I've come to really love it. I like the way it frames my opinion of myself. I like the way every time I start to think I'm important or cool or smart or have things figured out, the reality of that complexity smacks me back down to, I think, a more realistic place for me to continue to exist as a thinker and as a person who has relationships and engages with things in the world. So, commenter, whose name I continue to refuse to say, I think you've asked a great question, and I'm really grateful that you asked it. And I guess I've said this in the past few videos, but I'll say it one more time. I would encourage you, is that too strong a word? I would invite you to consider leaving some things in the question box instead of trying to get everything in the answer box right now, and exploring some of this complexity and seeing if there might be some merit to it and something really inviting and appealing about it. I feel like I've maybe talked a little bit too much about all of this stuff, but I just kind of want to do a quick video where I just turn it on, don't edit it, and game it out with you. So very excited, as always, to hear what you think about it. I like the comment section on this channel, and I really do try to go through everything, even if I don't have the ability or time to respond to all of it. You make me think, and I'm grateful for that. So at any rate, yep, thanks for hanging out. I've got some more completely different than this stuff coming down the pike, so I'll get back to editing that right now. All right, we'll catch you soon.